Hi everyone. So in this video we're going to be looking at unconscious bias. Now this is the work that Turner Phrase does most of in schools and businesses. Now what is unconscious bias? Well, thinking about this image that we're faced with here, a doctor, a male doctor. Unconscious bias would be when we are asked to think about a doctor, what is the first image that comes into our head? Is it a male doctor? Is it a female doctor? Now, unconscious bias would suggest that we have been culturally led to assume that it's going to be a male doctor first. That's a very sort of simplified version of it, but it's dealing with our unconscious biases, basically, the things that we make decisions on without really knowing it. So this breaks it down a bit more. Social categorization. So we rapidly sort people into groups so that we can focus on a task. We must establish roles and expectations of the other each time. Now, in fact, our behavior towards other people is more likely to be influenced by our instinctive feelings than by any complex thinking about the facts we have at hand, even if we convince ourselves it is purely a rational decision. So, our brains are being hardwired to rapidly categorize people instinctively. We use the most obvious and visible categories to us. So, things that I've sort of listed here that might come into that are age, body weight, physical attractiveness, skin color, gender, disability. But we use many other less visible dimensions as well, such as accent, social background, sexual orientation, nationality, religion, education, and so on. Now, these categories automatically assign a whole suite of unconscious characteristics, good and bad, to anyone categorized as being from that group. They're automatic and they're unconscious. So they're things over which we have little control. They influence everyone, no matter how unbiased we think we are. Now, despite our people biases being a natural and necessary process, any sort of bias has been demonized by the law and organizational culture. So this is interesting because what it does is it creates a taboo around even talking about those biases. None of us likes to admit that we might be biased in a particular situation or with a particular person or group of people. But again, part of this work and the work that we do is making people aware that the fact that they're not to blame for it. These are instinctive things that are part of something we've learned because of evolution, that we are part of the sort of flight and fight mechanism, that we need to quickly work out if someone's a friend or a foe. But at the same time, obviously, we now live in a society where we come down very hard on people who show prejudice. And so then often that creates a taboo about talking about the issue even. So there's a sort of problem there that we need to be able to have open conversations about our own biases and try to work on those. Now, our bias blind spot makes us vulnerable to exhibiting unintentional behaviors we probably won't notice and will almost certainly deny. And I think that ties into the whole taboo situation, because we don't engage with it on a daily basis. Therefore, we don't want to admit to ourselves where our kind of biases might actually be. We don't need to believe the stereotype for it to impact our behavior. We just have to be exposed to it. So I think we all consciously know what prejudices there are in the world, and that we have a very strong value system against prejudice. Yet, even in the sort of smallest work situations in everyday life, there are still things that are going on that allow stereotypes to persist. And I'll be the first to admit that when we think about, like when the word doctor is used, for example, that my brain traditionally has gone to the image of a male first, which is a problem. I think it's a real problem, but that's because it's been culturally encouraged over years and years, and so it becomes a habit that we need to break. And I think it's about taking that issue of blame away from ourselves, which will then enable us to work on that. So this is just sort of looking at the science behind that, and the fact that it's an automatic and rapid process that begins 250 milliseconds before our conscious processes engage. So it shows how it's part of the subconscious and instinctive side of us. And therefore why we are all exposed to being prejudiced from time to time. So how might this come into play in an interview situation? Well, there are any number of ways in which unconscious bias can be at work within an interview situation. Taking a few examples, if you were going into an interview and you were facing an all-male panel and you were a female, there would be essentially some unconscious bias at work and in both yourself and the panel in terms of how you might be viewing that situation and whether you would feel like power is balanced, whether you would feel like you were being represented, about assumptions that might be being made about you. And it obviously stretches completely outside of gender as well and across other intersections. So we make judgments about the way people are dressed, their social background, their sort of ethnicity can come into it, or religion can come into it as well, that we will be making these tiny judgments based on lots of intersections. And I think we just need to be aware that we do that in groups and as individuals. So these are some of the sort of biases you might encounter in an interview: infinity bias, contrast bias, confirmation bias, and attribution bias. Now, I want you to go away and your task is to go and find out what each of these are. Some of them might be immediately recognizable if you think about what the words mean, but I'd like to go away and sort of have a look at each of these types of bias and how they might be at work in an interview setting. Now, part of the issue is that asserting a non-biased position actually leads to an increase in the likelihood of prejudiced behaviour in people with low levels of bias. So there's part of the problem is there's an ironic effect to this, that when you can when you make people aware of it sometimes who have low levels, that it actually can have the opposite effect sometimes. And we go through this period of being overly conscious about where we might be prejudiced, and we have to learn new techniques and ways of incorporating that into our way of thinking. So there's being aware as well of where we can sort of react against that. And backlash effect is sort of taking that on. The idea that pressure from other people to avoid bias can make us angry and feel attacked, and therefore that we react negatively to that and then are more likely again to behave with bias. So it's just being aware that when we're dealing with this issue, and you'll probably all experience moments, situations where you feel like that didn't feel fair, or I felt I was being judged unfairly because of ... And I think, again, we need to be aware of the potency and power behind judgments, and that we need to all as individuals be behaving in a way where we're aware of, well, how might our behavior be perceived as bias. And really, I think part of that is working as an individual to try and be fairer. And simply asking someone to be fair can achieve better decision making. It's about an awareness. And if we sort of talk when we go into businesses and schools, we just talk about them, talk to them about their interview process, how they go about their hiring process, how their physical space is set up at work, and just asking them like, well, have you consulted everyone on whether this works for them, or does this have problems that we're not even aware of? And that constant asking people to think about fairness engages people to deal with unconscious bias at a practical level. So what can you do to help yourself? Well, this may be work that becomes more relevant as you get older, and as many of you will be in positions of leadership and management down the line, and thinking about, well, what systems and processes do you want to have in place to help work against unconscious bias, whether that be in gender or in any other area. And also to be aware in interview settings or when you're making presentations that these are quite high pressured situations, and there will probably be some element of bias at work still, but you have to take that in your stride and then work out strategies for working against that. So that comes back to all of our work on thinking about, well, how are we presenting ourselves? What are we wearing? How are we engaging with people? Who do we look at? And all of those things can help us deal with unconscious bias as we move through it. So that's really just an introduction to what unconscious bias is, and is something really for you to go away and think about a bit more as you engage with this work.